Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you are ready for our last panel of this 2023 edition of the Outer Space Security Conference. Our next and last panel of this conference will explore building common understandings between stakeholders. I am happy to introduce our moderator for this panel, James Revel. He is the head of the Space Security and Weapons of Mass Destruction program at Unity, and he will be introducing the panel as well as each of the panelists in more detail. Again, sorry I sound like a broken record, but just a few housekeeping rules. If you could use your headphones when listening to the three virtual speakers, that we have joining us today, that would be great for those of you who are in the room. Also, for those of you who are in the room, if you ask a question, please switch off your mic afterwards. And beyond that, just come ready with your questions, and I hope that you enjoy this last panel. Thank you very much. Jamie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Almudena, and good afternoon to those of you in the room. Good morning, good evening to those of you online, and welcome to this final panel of OS23. I hope you're caffeinated and awake after what has been really quite a busy 2 days of discussion. I'm James Revel, and I'm delighted to be able to moderate this session. I think to provide a little bit of context over the course of the last 2 days, it's fairly clear this is not a new area of discussion, but space security is an area that is complex and it's evolving swiftly with dynamic risks emerging from changes in technology, but also access to and operations in space. It is within this context, as has been pointed out over the discussion the last 2 days, space security issues is complicated by subjective perceptions, competing priorities, inconsistencies in the use of language, and intersubjective meanings of terms. And this really creates scope for miscommunication, for misunderstanding, and potentially miscalculation. It's for these reasons that UNIDIA, with our colleagues in Secure World Foundation, have been working on projects such as the lexicon and such as the portal, which have been dispraised at several points in the discussion. But beyond this, we also recognise it's important to be able to forge and sustain common understanding around policies, around practices, around language related to space security issues. And this is going to be important if we are going to maintain space security. And indeed, I think this has been a recurring theme in discussions the past couple of days. I think in the last session, for example, Romina, I think you spoke about processes to achieve common ground as being important, as one of several examples. But of course, this panel, though, to discuss challenges and opportunities for fostering common understanding between states, stakeholders, disciplines, and across different groups and languages, cultures, and contexts, I'm delighted to be joined by 5 excellent panelists with different backgrounds and experiences to bring to the discussion. You can find more details about our panelists online, so I'm not going to go into any depth, but to provide very brief introductions, Aya Awamoto is Vice President of Policy and Government Relations with Astroscale in Japan. Guoyu Wang is an Associate Professor and Dean of the Academy of Air, Space, Policy and Law at the Beijing Institute of Technology, as well as the founder for the Beijing Harmonization Space Consultancy. Alexandre Valette, who's joining me on the panel here, is Chief of the Space Services Department in the Radio Communications Bureau of the International Telecommunications Union. And Hannah Ashford is Managing Director of the Carmen Project, which is an initiative designed to foster trust, cooperation and independent dialogue between public and private stakeholders with a view to positively impacting upon space. And also joining us online is Claudio Leopoldino, who is Head of the Division for Disarmament and Sensitive Technologies with the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you all for taking the time to join. And without further ado, I really want to launch straight into questions so we can make the most of the panel. So I'll turn to each of our panelists and invite them to make some opening remarks before then opening the floor to you, our audience, both online and in person, to raise any questions you may have. And I please encourage you, please do raise questions. It'd be useful to make an interactive discussion. But perhaps if I can start and turning to you, Aya, online, I should note I appreciate you joining because I think it's quite late in Japan, so thank you for taking the time. But I was hoping you could provide an industry perspective on challenges and opportunities for building common understandings around space security. Particularly drawing from your experience, are there particular challenges that we see or potentially specific processes which have helped in generating shared understandings of different concerns? And with that, Aya, the screen should be yours.
you, James, for the kind introduction. And first of all, thank you, Unideal, for holding this panel and inviting me to this critical discussion. And as for the question by James, it is definitely not an easy task to balance diverse views to foster mutual understanding on what it means for space security and what actions are needed to deal with space security threats. And commercial space industry is not monolithic. There's a wide variety of activities like launching services, communication, Earth observation, human space flights, or on-orbit servicing, and also there are ground segments as well. So my view does not represent the whole industry's view, nor my company's view, but I would try to share some general thoughts on the question that might be relevant to the discussion in Geneva. And one of the major challenge for me is the rapidly changing landscape on space security. We are seeing the significant structural or architectural and operational changes in space activities in all aspects, not only space security, but also civil and commercial aspects as well. And it is becoming more and more important for states to have a strong space industry to provide services to all end users. And in this regard, how space assets and how space services will be used and what operation in space for defense purpose or the perception on risk associated with them are also being developed or changing currently. And this creates complexity for the industries in understanding what kind of impacts and risks would be brought to them by these developments. And I would like to highlight some of these, I think, outstanding changes here. One such example is probably the recent development on how commercial services are used in operation during conflicts, as seen in the war in Ukraine. And I think one state declared commercial companies could be a legitimate target during the conflict, and cyber attacks against one of the commercial companies are also reported. So this is new kind of developments for the industry. And also under the current so-called great power competition, operation during the situation of competition or gray zone under the threshold of armed conflict is also becoming more important for defense purposes. And we know that the commercial services are used to increase resiliency of the architecture. And also there's a growing interest by states in utilizing commercial innovation. And I think in the discussion yesterday, there was discussion on deterrence in the space, but also the concept of deterrence in this space is also evolving. So we are still not sure how commercial services would be utilized for the optimization of the defense purposes. So this also creates a complexity as well. And the second possible challenge is diverse views on understanding on space security itself. What does it mean for space security for commercial operators? Could be different and varied. For some company, it may mean stability or economic growth or predictability or simply means for peace. And how to evaluate the current situation could also be very different. And to be honest, there might be some companies sees the situation as more defense contracts, or some company may see it's a risky environment. And also companies like us on astroscales may be competitive or contested or hostile relation among states could also affect probably could be a sort of impediment to create a conducive environment for creating a consensus on active debris removal or any consensus on debris. So that said, I think there are so many challenges, but I'd like to move on to opportunities. And what is important is probably look into opportunity rather than difficulties or challenges. And I think when we think of what could be a basis for a common understanding among the industries or among different actors, I think space sustainability would be the one to connect everyone to form a common understanding. And as recent report by UNIDEO published by Almudena and Sarah on space security, safety, and sustainability, as it says, these three are kind of intertwined relations, and there are some level of correlations or overlapping areas among these three. Of course, they are not completely the same. For example, safety requirements does not meet sustainability requirement, but there are certain overlaps. So how to leverage this overlapping area could be an opportunity. And indeed, it is a commercial sector's interest to keep outer space predictable, safe, secure, and sustainable for their business. There's a strong incentive to do that. And I see defense actors are also interested in keeping space sustainable. I think the ASAT moratorium is one such an example, and I think the US military has issued a tenet of responsible behavior that includes limiting the generation of long-lived space debris. So, and I also see more interested in shaping or developing norms, not only from the commercial sector or diplomats, but even from those defense related people. So I would say there's a genuine interest among all space actors to keep space sustainable. And this could be a basis for mutual understanding that would make global discussion going forward in a tangible and useful way. And in this regard, sorry for taking such a long time, but ensuring transparency of missions or increased communication between operators would be a key. And there are actually existing efforts by industry, confers for on-orbit servicing or SS utilization of SSA data. There's a Space Data Association to share SSA data among commercial operators, and also some of the best practices developed by industry groups. So commercial actors can provide practical input on these issues on transparency and communication. And also states could also encourage transparency and communication for commercial missions through their regulation. So I would say these should be taken an opportunity, and that needs to be probably discussed. And lastly, I would also like to point out here that under this dynamically changing environment, discussion as today, security conference by UNIDIO or OEWG involving states are very important, not only for TCBMs among states, but also for industry to help understand states' thinking, what operations are being planned by states or what activities could consider to be a risk or threat. And in this regard, I think several states have issued doctrines or defense policies for space operation. I know that EU defense space strategy has been issued early this year, and also Japan released its space security initiative recently. And we cannot underestimate the importance of these communication from states, and probably that would be helpful commercial industry to understand what's happening in the space governance. And with that, I would like to stop, and I'll hand it over the screen to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you much, Aya. I think that's really helpful in setting out a rich set of challenges, but also providing us a really useful list of opportunities as well. Indeed, we welcome solutions, optimism there, particularly, I think, on the last panel. So thank you very much. And in that context, perhaps we can turn to you, Claudio. So from your experience working on space, but also other disarmament and sensitive technology-related issues, it'd be good to get your sense of how can we best identify and reconcile divergent priorities and concerns, particularly in these technically complex areas. And following from some of the discussion yesterday, how do we build trust and channels of communications between states and stakeholders? And the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James, and thanks to UNIDIR for putting together this very interesting conference. I regret that I'm not able to participate in person. I did, however, make an effort to listen to the previous panels, at least the ones on yesterday. And I think it's been an extremely interesting discussion and thought-provoking and useful as well to chart the way ahead in this field. So, as regarding your questions, I think that the lack of a common understanding is what is hobbling progress in this issue, and it's not something new. For a long time, since PAROS was included in the agenda of the international community in 1978, there's been a profound lack of a common basis on which to conduct these discussions. For a long time, this has been seen as an issue that affected mainly the main spacefaring actors, and the rest of the international community was more or less an interested spectator in these discussions. But the situation has changed tremendously since 1978, when the SSOD first highlighted the importance of discussing the need to prevent arms race in outer space. And in many ways, the current situation is much more complex than it was back then. First of all, the use of space no longer reflects the dynamics of bipolar strategic competition. The number of actors, governments and commercial entities that are active in space, launching and operating space objects, has increased manifold. And as has the number, of course, of satellites in orbit. We have a very congested situation in outer space. And this has meant that space has become much more accessible and much more commercially and strategically valuable than it was during the Cold War space race. And this, we have also to bear in mind that space-based technologies are now essential to practically all national economies and modern societies, and is a critical backbone for entire sections of the world economy. So one of the main developments in the past few decades is that there's been a slow and then sudden realization that space security is not an issue that affects the national interests of major spacefaring nations only, and that all states have a stake in this. So at least there's this positive development that states are becoming much more involved in this. A wide variety of states are becoming much more involved in these discussions, and this has been reflected in the OAWG that has just concluded. But at the same time, there is also the OAWG also proved that the stalemates that have prevented progress in this regard are still very much there, and there's even a sense of disheartenment from my side, at least my personal part, when we look at the history of discussions on space security and see that the same issues that have been dividing us since 1981, when the first two UNGA resolutions on the issue of PAROS were put forward in the first committee, are still very much there. In 1981, two competing resolutions, as some of you, of course, may know, were put forward for the first committee. One of them called for the prohibition of placement of weapons in outer space, while another called for prohibition of anti-satellite systems. This divide, which was along geopolitical lines back then, and it still very much is to this day, has remained more or less the same. So I think that we have been talking about these issues for more than 40 years now. So I think this brings me to my main vision or proposal or idea that I want to highlight here, which is the fact that we need to avoid repeating the same points that have been made in this past 45 years, hoping that somehow the answers to these calls will change. We need new approaches and fresh thinking. And my perception is that not only do we need new approaches and fresh thinking, but we need the holistic approach. An approach that takes into account the security concerns of all states, all stakeholders, but in particular all states in this regard. We've seen in the recent past some initiatives that focus on specific issues, such as the proposal on the moratorium on the placement of weapons in outer space, the NFP proposal, the non-forced placement proposal, and the more recent proposal on a moratorium on direct ascent anti-satellite testing. We believe that these specific and focused proposals are very helpful, can be very helpful, but their contribution to our debate will not advance if there is no common understanding on how to tackle space security and PAROS as a whole. Otherwise, we will be locked into this competition among states about whose priorities or whose views should come first. Until these divides, and for this, of course, there's an urgent need for trust, and for trust to be built, there's no substitute for direct dialogue. The problem is that the most relevant actors in this field right now not talking to each other, but rather talking past each other. Until these divides can be breached, I think that what we can do is to ensure that at least we have an appropriate venue for dialogue on space security and PAROS to take place. In this regard, the upcoming GGE on PAROS, that is going to start at the end of this semester, has a very important role to play, and we sincerely hope that the failure of the past OEWG and of the last GGE on PAROS, which was chaired by Brazil, will not cast a shadow on the upcoming GGE. I heard this expression from my colleague Bassem from Egypt yesterday, and share his perception. But I hope that instead of casting a shadow, this experience will be, the experience of previous four will be heeded and channeled towards achieving concrete advances towards an LBI and a legally binding instrument on PAROS. But nevertheless, notwithstanding the importance of the GGE format, which still can be helpful, we believe that there's a need to ensure the continuation of open and inclusive discussions on space security and PAROS. And it's very encouraging to hear that so many states, I believe that all of the states that I have heard speaking about this during this conference, have underlined the recognition of this of how important this inclusive format of the OEWG has proven. But I do believe as well that there is a need to consider very carefully how to frame the debate for the continuation of these universal and open discussions. And we are particularly hopeful that the sponsors of the UNGA resolutions that have served as a basis for dialogue on PAROS and space security try their best to bridge their differences and to offer us, the international community, one clear path ahead, avoiding redundancies and conflicting mandates. As for what these mandates should be, there's been a great discussion about whether should we proceed with non-binding norms or as a means to achieve PAROS, or if we should go straight to the objective of a legally binding instrument on PAROS. We still believe that there is no opposition between the two, but it's absolutely apparent from the last session of the OEWG that some states do fear that the norm building approach is nothing but the diversionary tactic. And we have to say, then we have to recognize that given the history of discussions in the Conference on Disarmament in this matter, these concerns are not unwarranted at all. So in our view, what can be done? When the last OEWG was created, many states that have long advocated the need for an LBI on PAROS, such as Brazil, took a leap of faith by accepting the idea that non-binding norms could contribute towards that goal. Maybe now it's time for those states that have long had misgivings and reservations about an LBI on PAROS to also take their leap of faith and affirm their willingness to start negotiations towards that end. That's my 2 cents on this matter. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity, and look forward to discussions and further discussions in this panel. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I think it's a useful reminder of continuity and change in space security related discussions, and I certainly take note of your point on the leap of faith. That could perhaps apply to a number of arms control disarmament processes at the moment. Perhaps if we can turn to our panelists in the room, first of all, and perhaps if I could turn to you, Alexandre. So ITU is a leading organisation working on, among other things, international coordination, notification and recording of specific radio frequencies, those transmitted and received by satellites. That strikes me as requiring some serious coordination and common understanding. So could you talk us through some of the challenges in fostering common understanding and how you've addressed those challenges? And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. This morning, Andrew Peebles asked you how many of you were knowing UNOSA, and you were a bit shy to say you all know UNOSA. But I don't think it is necessarily the case for ITU, so I will give you a brief background on our organization. We are the International Telecommunication Union. We were founded in 1865 as the International Telegraph Union. Then in 1932, we became the International Telecommunication Union. And in 1947, we joined the UN system as a specialized agency, and we are now the UN Specialized Agency for Information and Communication Technology in general. In relation to space, as mentioned by James, we are maintaining a database of radio frequencies used by satellite worldwide. To do that, and due to our long history, I would like to highlight two specificities of ITU that may be interesting in the context of this panel. The first one is a legal specificity. We have a legal system that is based on three layers of instruments. We have basic legal instruments that contains the high-level principles of international telecommunication law, and that they are quite stable over time. We then have, and this is one of the main original aspects of ITU, we have a second layer of treaty, of legally binding instruments that are called the administrative regulations. And these regulations are very strange treaties because they are not stable at all. They are reviewed and revised de facto every 4 years. So every 4 years, we revise and review, we review first and we revise appropriately these treaties, these administrative regulations, in order to keep pace with the technological advancements in the telecommunication sector. The other aspect related to these administrative regulations is that our legal systems contain a clause whereby administrations or whereby member states are automatically bound to consent to revisions of this treaty if they don't oppose to this beforehand. So you revise the treaty. If you don't say, oh, I don't want to be bound by the revision, then you are automatically bound, which is not completely common in matter of treaties. Finally, we have a third layer of documents which are called standards or recommendations, which are not legally binding, but still are approved officially by member states. And this leads to my the second specificity of ITU that may be interesting into this panel is the membership of ITU. We have 193 member states, so the 193 member states of the UN. But we have also around 1,000 members from the private sector and the academic world. And I insist on the word members. They are not observers. They are members of ITU. They don't have the same rights than member states. Only member states, of course, negotiate and decide on treaties. But they are not observers. They are members. And for example, for all the non-binding documents, or the preparatory work to treaties, the members for the private sector, for the academic world, have the right to participate to meetings, they have the right to make proposals, they have the right to chair meetings. And this is also something that is a bit uncommon in the UN system, that has a very long history. We opened the first member for the private sector in ITU, was admitted to ITU in 1925. So it's not something very new, it's not something absolutely unknown for the international community. This leads me to the three main challenges we see to reach common understanding in the field of space and in general on space security in particular. I think the first and predominant challenge has been addressed already by several panelists before, and this is the lack or the absence of political will, the absence of underlying willingness to reach common understanding. We should be honest with this. There is no solution to circumvent this absence of political will, and it's a bit vain to believe that a very complex organization or very complex practical arrangements may circumvent the will of nations. International law is fundamentally based and made by the sovereign states. If sovereign states don't want to make international law, there will not be any international law, and we should recognize it. This being said, it may be interesting to analyze a bit why this political will may be absent. In my view, in space, this is the conjunction of three phenomena that we observe. One, which in my view, in our community or in a forum like that, is a bit underestimated, is that many countries do not give to space or do not have the need to give to space a sufficient level of political attention to trigger political discussions on international law. And this is interesting to see also the the attendance of this conference, for example, we are not a conference where the 193 United Nations countries are participating. And this is true in general. One good example that I can give is when my Secretary General in ITU want to discuss with one country about a telecommunication issue, we will contact the permanent mission here in Geneva and we will ask, can we organize a meeting with the minister in charge of telecommunication? In all 193 countries, there is a minister in charge of telecommunication. If the same question is put to the permanent mission, could we speak to the minister in charge of space? Then we will receive three kind of answers. In a few number of countries, there will be an answer, yes, the minister in charge is this person, we will arrange a meeting. In many countries, or in a good number of countries, we will receive a question, we have several ministers in charge of space, and you need to give us more precisions. And in the majority of countries, the answer will be there is no minister in charge of space. And this is quite an important issue. Of course, for the satellite community or for the space community, the space lawyers and the space enthusiasts, it is not very often seen, but this is something that really hampers the progress. And this is, in my view, one of the main phenomena. The second phenomenon is that in some countries, they view the development of multilateral space law with reluctance because they fear or they feel that it will hamper the development of their space activities. And of course, if they see international law as simply providing constraints, well, things will not move up. Normally, international law provides to states a balance of rights or balance of guarantees in exchange of some limitations, in exchange of some duties. And this is important to find a good balance. Finally, the third phenomenon that contributes to this absence of political will, in my view, is that on many subjects, there is no real convergence at expert level on the main options that the diplomats may discuss or negotiate. So we should realize as well that in a number of issues related to space and to space security, the technical work has not been converging yet. So it's difficult for governments to give instructions to diplomats to negotiate something, whereas the facts and figures are not necessarily all settled. This is, in my view, leading to the second challenge, which, especially in a field where the technical and the scientific aspects are mixed with legal approaches and political decisions, this is the ability to frame the discussions around what I call viable options. And a viable option for me, it's scenarios which provide a legally and technically sound framework for diplomatic negotiations and political decisions. So in my view here, there are two dangers. Sometimes the experts are too keen to say, oh no, my solution is perfect, and there is nothing more to discuss. So if this is so, believe me, they will not get any political attention, because if there is only one solution, there is nothing to negotiate, nothing to discuss. There is one solution, this will by default happen. But this is very often a mistake from the experts. No, there is not one solution that is technically sound. There is very often more than that, and this is the work of the diplomats and of the politicians to make sure that they let the experts work on various feasible options. The second danger, in my view, is that we create scenarios that are completely disconnected from facts, scientific facts, or science or good legal practice. So, for example, you can have an idea that, okay, if Newton's law does not apply, then we can simplify things and so on. Yes, unfortunately, Newton's law applies and you cannot do anything else. The same is true for legal aspects. You can say, oh, let's imagine that we can have a treaty that is completely retroactive and starts from the 60s. Yes, but again, treaties are generally not retroactive, and there is principles in the international law, in the Convention of Vienna, that prohibit, well, that greatly discourage the retroactivity of treaties. So this is what I call a viable option, is an option that makes sense from a technical and legal point of view. But still, there should be more than one option, because behind that, there are political decisions and negotiations between diplomats to be made. And the third, so the solution for that, in my view, is to be clear on where and how to build these options. In my view, these options should be built by experts and governments alike. So there should be here a kind of quite open discussion with the clear understanding that experts should not take the role of governments. The governments will decide and will negotiate the treaties, because they are the only parties to the treaty. So since they are the parties to the treaties, they are the ones that negotiate. But they should negotiate on the basis of the best expertise available. And specific to space, I think the third challenge is the fear of regulating too much or regulating too early activities that are constantly changing and where a lot of innovation exists. So this is not really only a fear, this is a rational argument, because indeed we see a lot of changes. Here, I would say my suggestion, my proposed solution would be to look at the ITU model and see if it could be replicated or meaningfully for the other issues. And the particularity of the ITU model that I would like to highlight is this idea of having different levels of treaties, with stable treaties that may be like the Outer Space Treaty, and also not so stable treaties that we could call administrative regulations, like in the ITU, and which are deemed, in fact, to be reviewed and revised regularly and at a regular pace to keep pace with the advance in technology. So this could alleviate this fear or this danger of regulating too much or too early. And so, in conclusion, I think there are big challenges. Some of them are quite strong, but for each of them, we can also develop some steps and try to also be more inclusive in the discussions, so that it receives the level, ultimately it receives the level of political attention that will end up with, in my view, unlocking the difficulties to reach common understanding. Thank
you very much, Alexandre. I'm sort of fascinated to know how you manage 1,000 members from the academic and private sector. That sounds quite daunting. And you raised the point about high-level political attention. I think that's something we may follow up on, because I'd be interested in ideas related to that. Expert solutions, perfect or otherwise, I think would be very useful on that topic. I'm now going to turn to you, Anne, if I may. So your organisation fosters cooperation and independent dialogue between global leaders in technology, science, business, politics and the arts, so those that want to make a positive impact on space. It's also an interdisciplinary body, so jet lag permitting, if possible, how would you go about navigating differences in backgrounds and disciplines to bring people together on the same page? The floor is yours.
Thanks, James, and thank you so much for your question, and to UNIDIR and all delegates here for welcoming me, albeit jet lagged, as James mentioned. So look, before I turn to the how in terms of navigating, and indeed I would say leveraging differences in terms of backgrounds and disciplines to build common understandings among varying stakeholders in space, I would like to briefly recanvass the urgency of the why and highlight why it is that we need this proactive efforts to engage with non-state stakeholders. So I'm pleased, particularly from the previous panel, that we've seemed to have reached a common understanding regarding the necessary involvement of all nations when it comes to matters of space security, be they spacefaring, emerging, or non-spacefaring. And I truly believe that this must continue to be extended to other relevant stakeholders, including private actors, industry, academia, civil society, all to secure this collective future in space. So, I mean, firstly and quite frankly, we must involve these stakeholders because we have to. So we know that many of the most prominent and transformative developments in the space domain are driven by actors in the private sector. And as Aya mentioned earlier, they're rapidly changing. So private actors own and operate the majority of active satellites in orbit. I don't need to tell all of you that. And as we know, they can possess dual use and dual purpose capabilities, which bring immense benefits to our life here on Earth, but also pose a risk of exacerbating tensions if deployed without clear and internationally agreed rules and norms. So commercial space activities frequently lack a clear regulatory home, and commercial goals and security goals can conflict with one another. Particularly with matters such as the sustainable access to space, spectrum allocation, as I'm sure Alexandra knows, data collection and sharing, and space resource utilization. So as our colleague Joanne Wheeler mentioned yesterday, we're now living in a time of increased activity and contracting timescales where the potential proliferation of global crises are well and truly within this lifespan. And from my observation of working with various stakeholders in the private and public sector, there is an acute awareness within the private sector of the need to protect assets, of course, for financial and operational reasons, yes, but ultimately all stakeholders, be they state or non-governmental stakeholders, have a vested interest in keeping space safe, secure, and of course, sustainable in the long term. So beyond the fact that we have to, we should engage with various stakeholders because there's immense value in doing so. So informed dialogue, as many of our colleagues here have alluded to, will facilitate informed policy making. So it's about bringing those new approaches and fresh thinking, which Claudio also just alluded to. So it's about increased awareness and transparency, and increasing this among private actors will also increase ownership and responsibility, instilling a sense of urgency in existing roadmaps and workforces. So I also had a look at the opening address from Ms. Nakamitsu, the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in last year's conference. And she noted when addressing us that the purpose of involving such stakeholders is not to replace executive decision-making and this role that states must necessarily play, again, as Alexandra just mentioned, but rather it's an opportunity to elevate these international rules, regulations, and norms to other stakeholder communities. So it is about complementarity, which again has been mentioned many, many times throughout this conference. So I suppose the question then is how we integrate these non-state stakeholders into these conversations in a systemic manner and persuade them to get active. So again, it comes down to creating opportunities for informed and broadly representative dialogue. And that also comes back to James's question about navigating different backgrounds and disciplines. So at the Carmen Project, we work with a variety of stakeholders coming from both the public and private sector to facilitate forums for strategic dialogue and trust building, with the aim to increase awareness about what's happening in various different regions and disciplines, and of course, common understandings for security, safety, and long-term sustainability in space, whilst also encouraging tangible partnerships, joint projects, and commitments between people coming from these different disciplines and regions. And again, we spoke earlier about the importance of these partnerships. So concretely, we work with all different types of stakeholders. We work with astronauts, we work with space agency directors, leaders of commercial entities, entrepreneurs, researchers, artists, and we bring them together. They currently represent 60 nations worldwide. And our intention isn't necessarily to get everyone on the same page, as you've mentioned, but it is about creating first and foremost a safe space, often utilizing the Chatham House rule, which I think is quite an enabling tool in terms of accelerating some of these conversations to allow people to express themselves and listen to other views. So when we look at engaging in similar models of multi-stakeholder dialogue, I believe that the international security community can gain very useful and bottom-up expertise and perspectives regarding technical and geopolitical threats to space operations and how these can be mitigated. We can understand more about behaviors that are considered to be hostile and harmful. We can understand more about perceived thresholds for escalation because, of course, these vary immensely. Naturally, there will be divergence in terms of these perspectives. But that divergence in itself is very, very helpful for policymakers in terms of identifying potentials for misunderstandings and escalations. And of course, among the stakeholders who are engaging in this dialogue themselves, the creation of the safe space to engage in this consultation is trust building in and of itself. And this shouldn't be underestimated in terms of increasing understandings and strengthening those international relationships. So secondly, informed and representative dialogue between these stakeholders, in my opinion, must be made more regular and accessible. And I think that also speaks to what you were just saying, Alexandre. And on that front, I really commend UNIDIR and Secure World Foundation for their efforts in both dedicated and intersessional forums, and the recent open-ended working group likewise. And I'm heartened also to see things like the Summit of the Future having dedicated efforts towards these multi-stakeholder forums. I believe that we need to continue in these efforts and consider the permanent and systemic integration of non-state stakeholders into such forums. We need to ensure that they can easily contribute to information sharing mechanisms such as registries and notification systems. Perhaps we can even provide platforms for private actors to make their own unilateral commitments. Indeed, I think we can take inspiration from the ITU model that Alexandre has just spoken to, where commercial players are active members rather than mere observers. So this expansion beyond the diplomatic community to a more systemic, inclusive model will involve a lot of work. And as Peter mentioned this morning as well, it's a lot of time is required to understand and socialize certain ideas, particularly when you're dealing with such diversity in disciplines and backgrounds. But it's necessary. So beyond the immense value in leveraging informed expertise and dialogue for informed policy, we also need to consider as well, in space where we are right now, that the exponential increases in technology from the private sector and the resulting norms and behaviors of private players who have significant power and influence in security matters that needs to be well considered and proactively considered. So I will essentially leave it there because, of course, we want to get into some time for discussion. And I know we have one other colleague online who needs to give his opening address. But I would just say there is more of a hopeful message in terms of accompanying this more overarching message of urgency. And I believe that we have something very unique in terms of space when it comes to the passion and the willingness of our community to actively engage in such dialogue. I think that there's a real passion among the space community in terms of the people who work within this sector. And indeed, this can be leveraged to help us navigate some of these issues around political will, which we've spoken to as well. There will be non-governmental entities that will be willing to be proactive in exercising their independent capacity to engage in certain proactive measures towards space security, even if there is a real or perceived lack of political will at that national level. And indeed, I believe that we can really leverage this engagement and this passion to our collective advantage. So I'll leave it there for now, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I think your point on non-state actor perspectives integration has also been raised this year by our director and then Secretary General Ryder, I think, as well as being part of the Secretary General's 7th policy brief on space issues as well, so it's important. Yeah, and also thank you for ending on a hopeful note. Always appreciated. So the question related to challenges in building common understanding and tools and approaches that you think could be helpful. The screen is yours, Guoyu.
Great, thank you so much for the floor. And as to the challenges, we might just see one of it. That's the lawyer can hardly handle technical matters. So of course we already learned a lot from this discussion. I mean, in the previous panels. Many challenges to us, no matter from legal, political, or technical perspective. But here I would like to address just one of them, which might not be duly noticed. That is the dichotomy of soft law and hard law. So we see a lot of debates on that. Which one is better? Which one is more effective? Which one is more practical to promote space security governance? And as the tool or the approach which would be helpful, so I just propose a third approach, interpretation of Lex Lata. So I just suggest we should seek for common understandings of interpretation of Lex Lata, the existing legal framework, legal systems, on specific space scenarios as soon as possible, as a third option, of course. So first, I would like to address a little bit on the existing common understanding about soft law and hard law. Although we are facing so-called soft law hard law divergence, more and more views expressed that these two approaches could be put in parallel, and the soft law is complementary to soft law. Second, I would like to talk about the existing misunderstandings and confusions to be clarified in this case. Two typical views would be mentioned here. So the first one, in the discussion of the OEWG on responsible behavior, some delegations mentioned that the Outer Space Treaty, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, is developed from 1963 declaration, and subsequently drew a conclusion that according to drafting history of space treaties, soft law is the precondition to make hard law. However, as a matter of fact, the initial and common goal of those delegations at that time is to seek for binding treaties. So merely USSR proposed a comprehensive draft treaty, and the other one is about to rescue astronauts. Instead, the US preferred a treaty about liability. Therefore, the relation between soft law and hard law should be examined case by case. In this case, it could even be argued that none other than the debates about treaties drafting paved the way of having a UNGA resolution of soft law. And the second view was expressed that soft law is the most efficient and practical approach or tool for space security governance at present. In fact, the expected rules here are more about TCBM than a soft law. TCBM are generally pragmatical to promote space security governance, since most of them are about notification, informing, coordination, consultation. However, TCBM alone can hardly be used to determine the boundary of legal and illegal behaviors. Thus, only the binding treaties and the interpretations of these treaties are the most effective tool in this regard. So as conclusion, first, we should re-examine the dichotomy of soft law and hard law approach, and should enhance our awareness about the significance to discuss interpretation of lex lata. Second, we should aim at drafting a new comprehensive treaty through this just to promote the discussion on PAROS, and take TCBM as complements to the existing treaties or any new treaties in future. Simultaneously, we should begin and reinforce the formal discussion on interpretation of lex lata to take full use of the existing legal tools. Any documents achieved from this discussion, no matter it appears as a non-legally binding one or legally binding one, would be taken as references to prevent and settle the possible space disputes in future. I just give an example. Suppose delegation could have consensus on the following rule. I just quote, states should strengthen authorization and continuous supervision of the space activities conducted by non-governmental entities under their jurisdiction or control, so as to prevent such activities from posing threats or causing misunderstanding to other states. These activities include, but not limited to, getting involved in armed conflicts between other parties, end of quote. Then such rule would provide specific instruction to the application of the authorization continuous supervision obligation under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty regarding specific scenario, say the involvement of commercial space activity, others armed conflicts. It can generate legally binding effects to the relevant state, even if this rule might be contained in the non-legally binding document. On account of this, I suggest that international community should consider this third approach, that is interpretation of lex lata, to avoid to be trapped in the contention about the dichotomy of soft law and hard law. I just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guoyu. I'm conscious there are at least 3 individuals with a legal background on this panel, so I don't think we're going to be lacking for questions. And really, on that note, I'd actually like to open up the floor or and the screen as well, and encourage those of you online, please do submit any questions you may have. And those of you in the room, if you'd like to raise any comments, questions or points, I am aware we've been here for 2 days in a windowless room. It's quite warm, but if you can bear with me for a little longer, any questions, comments would be most welcome. And the floor is open. Jessica, please, the floor is yours.
Great. This is Jessica Talk with the U.S. Just a question for the panel again. I think you had mentioned earlier, the panelist regarding the ITU. I guess one of the things that we have dealt with a lot, right, is the idea of regulating things that are quote unquote not ripe for discussion. There's a lot of things that could fall into the theoretical, right? How again does the ITU, what is the framework that you guys use to basically put those off or deal with like those types of issues that we would consider not ripe? Thank you.
We have a long history of also a treaty called the radio regulations, so regulating, for example, radio communications. When I say long, it's very long because the first edition was in 1906. But this is interesting. In the first edition of this treaty in 1906, the international community agreed to regulate two radio frequencies. More than 100 years now, we are regulating all the radio spectrum from 8.7 kilohertz to 3 terahertz. So, but it has not been done in one step, I would say. It was driven by needs to extend the regulations because the technology was evolving. So I would say that it's a balance. It's done by this process of continuous review. So every 4 years, we convene treaty-making conference that we call World Radio Communication Conference. And they are not reviewing the entire treaty. They are working based on an agenda. And this agenda has been decided by the previous conference. So if you wish, every 4 years, we review and revise a part of the treaties, but also we, the member states, discuss and agree what are the priorities for the next 4 years. So during the next 4 years, what are the priorities to review or to add or to revise in the existing treaty? This allows also to put a bit in perspective the needs and the time frame, because in fact the member states decide on two things. They decide what has to be done for the next conference 4 years later, but also what should start to be studied for the second conference, the second following conference, 8 years later. And of course, this is based on the knowledge of the conference at the time. This may evolve during the cycle, but at least it gives a kind of structured framework for discussions. And while this is not perfect, at least this allows also some countries that believe that, okay, we should make a decision now. Well, the compromise can be, you see, there is not a lot of countries supporting that we make a decision now. However, if you agree that we postpone the decision and we study more during 4 years, then you can get consensus that, yes, this is an issue that should be on the agenda during the following 4 years. The advantage of our process is that if you are on the agenda for the next conference, then there is a mandatory preparatory studies that have to be made. So you, by agreeing to put, if the international community, the member states, agree to put it on the agenda, they also agree that there will be preparatory studies, so discussion and work. So it could also offer to member states that believe that it's very urgent a way forward, which is trying to build a consensus with others by saying, okay, we don't take a decision now, but we study it seriously for next time. And this is generally how we do things. Of course, this is always based on compromise and negotiations. This is not perfect. We can have some difficulties, but generally it works quite well because very often also, I would say, even if there is a very strong development, the need for regulations is not necessarily absolutely urgent to the day or to the year. A good regulation can wait for 4 years. I mean, especially if you have this process of making studies, because then everybody starts to think, things are becoming serious, we need to start about thinking about it and potentially preparing for regulations. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandre, and thank you for your question. Jessica, did you want a clarification, please?
Yes, actually, could I ask a follow-up? How do you guys do that? Like, what are the mechanisms? You know, when we were doing the LTS guidelines, we used expert working groups. Do you guys work by consensus, expert working groups, or is it 193 countries all working together in the same room on these studies?
Yes, thank you very much. No, it's our members. So as we have explained, we have a specificity about membership. So the preparatory studies leading to the next conference are open to all our membership. So the 193 members, states, but also the 1,000 members from the private sector and the academic world can contribute. So everybody has the right to participate. Everybody has the right to submit contributions, to submit studies and so on. And generally, we try to solve and make decisions by consensus. However, it's consensus, I will say, tempered by our rules. In our rules, it says that if consensus cannot be achieved, then one state has the right to call for a vote. And it only needs the support of one another state for the vote to happen, and the vote is by simple majority. It means that if you are, I would say, a blocking minority, you are in danger. If you just want to block for blocking, you are a bit in danger because then two states can call for a vote, and then a simple majority can overcome the vote, the blockage. So this never happens. So the last time we have had a vote on a legal issue at the World Radio Communications Conference, it was in 1995. And since then, we have never had a vote. So generally, in fact, consensus works. This is due to the fact, in my view, that everybody knows that if consensus is not reached, there is always this danger of voting. This is also due to the fact that with our agenda, you have several issues, and you can, I would say, make compromise between various issues. It's rare that you are in majority for all issues. So sometimes you will do compromise between issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Jessica, for the question. Also, I think there was a question from Emma at the back. Thank you for your patience. The floor is yours if you want to take it.
Sure, thank you. It's been a fascinating panel. I'm just wondering, so we've heard the majority of launches are not governmental but commercial. Is there concern that without hard laws, be they at a national level or international, that these commercial actors are not going to be incentivized to sort of keep space safe and sort of use it sustainably?
Aya, I think if you'd like to take the screen is yours, Aya.
No, I just wanted to point out that the simple fact that all of the commercial operators are basically under the regulation under the OST. So it's not like we are sort of outrageous to do anything we want. So that's all.
Thank you, Aya. And Goyu, did you want to take the floor on this question? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, James. Just AI is 100% correct. So always like launching license, or we say the license for radio frequency is required before any kind of a commercial launch, no matter, I mean, required by national legislation, space law, or we say it's also a reflection of the, I just mentioned, authorization and continuous supervision obligation stipulated in Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. So I cannot imagine that there will be any commercial launch would be conducted in a legal vacuum. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Goyu. To you, Alexandre, you wanted to take this question? Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, as mentioned by the previous speakers, both the Outer Space Treaties, also the ITU Constitution, mandates that the states make sure ensure supervision of the activities of non-governmental actors under their jurisdiction. This leads to these systems of national authorizations and so on, which normally prevents the launch of unauthorized vehicles in space. This is true for the outer space treaties, noting that the ratification of the outer space treaties is done by almost, I think, all nations that have actually a satellite in orbit. When I say a nation having a satellite, I mean a nation having either an entity within their jurisdictions having a satellite. And this is true also for frequencies because the 193 member states of ITU have ratified the treaty. So I would not be so concerned by the danger of something rogue happening. I would be more concerned by a problem or even a catastrophe by ignorance of the rules, because the rules are quite complex. We should acknowledge that. And even a good faith or a goodwill actor, a goodwill state, may face difficulties to actually implement the space or space-related treaties. And this is where, in my view, there is a specific usefulness into capacity building programs, and also the fact that there are, I would say, neutral or impartial bodies like UNOSA or like the Secretariat of ITU that can help states to implement the treaty they have signed. We should not underestimate the fact that these treaties are quite complicated to implement, and the main danger, in my view, is, yes, a catastrophe by ignorance.
Thank you, Alexandre. The idea of a catastrophe by ignorance actually leads to a question of my own, and it's a two-part question, really, but I'd be curious to know, and really this is to all panelists, how much awareness is there in the NGO and industry sort of actor community of the various regulations that we've been discussing, but more particularly space security related issues? And I appreciate the point I raised earlier that industry and actors are not monolithic, but a general sense from you would be interesting. I was also very much struck during the OAWG that there was a real buzz of sort of civil society, industry and academic energy that kind of surrounded that OAWG. So I'd be curious to get the views of panelists as to how do we sustain that, and how do we build on that, and how do we capitalize it in what is quite a rapidly changing and expanding community. If anybody would like to take that set of questions, they'd be most welcome to. I'm looking at you because you're close, Hannah, so please, the floor's yours.
Thank you. So, I mean, look, in terms of awareness, I would say that there is a strong awareness of space security among private stakeholders in general, but not necessarily a strong awareness of PAROS itself. I mean, I work with a lot of different stakeholders coming from private and academia, for example. Certain people are aware of the sort of PAROS agenda and the steps that have been proposed in terms of options to implement that at different levels. But many people are not aware of that at that sort of high conceptual level or beyond that conceptual level. In terms of how we can keep that momentum, I mean, I would also build on some of those comments of Krista this morning and also Aya in this panel in terms of, you know, we can address safety concerns first before addressing security. So it's really looking at those smaller steps, even in the absence of political will or necessarily the ability to tackle some of these more complex matters of space security when it comes to geopolitics. And I think that indeed, when it comes to matters of space safety, that is something that, you know, most stakeholders in the private sector and academia and whatnot are very invested in, because everyone can see that the long-term sustainability of space is something that is absolutely necessary to start, you know, very proactively addressing now. And indeed, I also liked the point that Krista made earlier that, you know, if we can build trust and cooperation during this process of really understanding how we build, you know, norms, rules, behaviors, regulations around space safety, so in terms of space situational awareness and whatnot, then we can also leverage the trust that has been built during that process to look into the more, say, difficult matters of space security. So I think that that's a way to sort of, you know, build on that energy and that willingness of the private sector to engage around matters that are immediately perhaps more relevant to them. I think sometimes people tend to think that matters of space security are to be left to, you know, those of you sitting in Geneva, rather than thinking that they're immediately relevant to them. Indeed, there is an awareness that, you know, ultimately it will affect everybody in space, no matter, you know, what your role, and indeed on Earth, given our reliance on all of the enabling technologies in space. But starting with space safety, which seems more immediate and more certainly relevant to all players, is a very practical step. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Guyo, I'll turn to you both shortly, but Claudio, if you'd like to take the floor and the screen now, then please do so.
One of the takeaways of the OEWG is how important it is to ensure that we hear the views of private sector and of academia and other non-governmental organizations, not only because they are very important stakeholders in the full sense of the word, because private sectors have become extremely important space actors, but also because their perspective helps us understand the challenges that we have to face. Many of the activities that private space actors are preparing to undertake may have bearing on security. I think, for example, of space debris mitigation and commercial activities. These can be, if not addressed properly, can lead to misperceptions, mistrust, and I think that them being aware of how their activities can impact on us and on states' activities in space, and the reverse is also extremely important. That we have experiences in many fora, such as, for example, for the OEWG on cybersecurity, regarding how best to include their views. I think that there are many options in terms of how to put this on the mandates. It needs to be on the mandates to avoid procedural discussions when the fora starts. But there must be also a need to promote active engagement in substantive matters and not just put the non-governmental organizations on the side burner. States will always have the primacy and the ultimate say, and there's no substitute for that. But we shouldn't be afraid to listen to the views of non-governmental organizations and the private sector and academia in this regard in any of our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I think we've heard a number of challenges over the last 2 days, but I think in this panel in particular, there's a number of solutions. So we discussed the importance of transparency, communications, platforms, interpretations of law, appeals to commercial interests and incentives, best practice sharing, events, creating a safe space, sharing policies, viable options, framing debates, trust building, and the IQ model, I think, was the one you raised, Alexandra. So my question for all of the panelists now, given this list of tools, options, solutions that we have, I'd be very interested to get your views on what one thing should be prioritized. What recommendation or top tip would you have for fostering common understanding moving forward? So if we can invite you all to address that question, but also any other points you'd like to raise in your concluding remarks. And perhaps we can start with you, Alexandra, if that's okay. We've done reverse order. Please, the floor is yours.
I think the things to prioritize is a bit something that was expressed by Dr. Wang. It's the need for more work on the consistent application of international law. Too often, I feel that the discussion about space law and space security are a bit disconnected from the rest of international law. One example that I can give is related to ITU, is in the ITU treaties, in the radio regulation, there is a prohibition of international jamming. So it's a very strong prohibition. International jamming, international radio jamming is prohibited by a treaty that 193 states have ratified. And in my view, this should be taken into account in the discussions on space security, because in fact there is already a treaty prohibiting international jamming. I'm perfectly aware that the ITU legal system has also a certain form of exception for military stations, which of course is very relevant for space security. But still, I don't think the discussions on disarmament or on space security can simply forget or can cannot take into account the fact that there exists a treaty ratified by all the UN member states that prohibit international radio jamming. And this is true in general. The interpretation of space treaties must also take into account the fact that there is a convention on the law of treaty, which has a complete section, Section 3 of the Vienna Convention, on the interpretation of treaties. So you cannot simply ignore that there are other treaties that are relevant for the application of the space law. I think this should be the things to prioritize, to insert space law into the more generic international law and having consistency in the various approach. And my recommendation will be on the different side. It will be on the need now to raise the level of the political attention on the discussion of space securities, and to do that in an inclusive manner. I mean, not only between spacefaring nations, but really coming to all nations of the UN, and potentially, I would say, motivating nations to become space actors, even if they are not spacefaring nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I propose if we take them in reverse order from the initial set of questions. So perhaps if we go Hannah, Guoyu, Claudio, and then Aya. So Hannah, please, the floor is yours.
I'll keep things brief because I'm conscious of the time, but I would echo my colleagues' sentiments in terms of reform needed around international law. And indeed, I think we work often in terms of dichotomies and understandings that actually prohibit us from progressing and already looking at, very enabling frameworks that are right in front of us. And if we sort of take stock and pause to really focus upon reinterpreting and really understanding what the common understandings are around the existing frameworks, that can be very beneficial at that executive governance level. Beyond that, when it comes to accelerating things, I think we can really leverage this bottom-up approach. And that comes back to my earlier points around really proactively looking at regular forums for informed and representative dialogue, so including stakeholders from various realms of civil society, ensuring that all nations, be they emerging, spacefaring or non-spacefaring, are represented in these discussions. And I would say that each person in this room has some level of decision-making power, and you would be involved in various consultative processes. So taking those opportunities to ensure that you are proactively engaging with different stakeholders whenever you have that opportunity, I think is a very practical and important first step. And I think ultimately we can use the dialogue that comes out of such forums to even look at creating some type of public repository of information around things like perceived threats, perceived escalation levels, and these can be very practical steps in terms of securing the future of space.
Thank you, Hannah. And Guoyu, if I can turn to you, apologies for the confusion before, but the screen is now yours.
Thank you, James. So just one more challenge to be addressed here during the discussion. That's the gap between the non-governmental stakeholders and the government regarding the priority and the concerns in space security. So we heard a lot about the concerns from private sectors about protection of space environment, space debris matter, how to avoid in-orbit collision. But from the governmental side, maybe they more concerned about their political national interests or some strategic goal. So I'm thinking maybe all of us, including the private sectors, just pay more attention to legal matters, to interpretation of lex lata. I think Alex just raised a very good example. So in the case of jamming, whether article, we say 45 or 48 in the ITU constitution would prevail. So it's a matter about your behavior will be deemed as legal or illegal. So my last point is that we should take full use of the existing or the future arms control platform to do this work. So as Claudio just mentioned, that shows his various concerns about the division among us. So I think maybe this interpretation of lex lata might provide opportunity to reunite us. So after all, I think no one would like to refuse the discussion of international law. Hopefully, I just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And perhaps now, if I can turn to you, Claudio, the screen is yours.
My final point would be that building on what I said in the beginning is that we need to push for a comprehensive debate that takes into account the security concerns of all actors. I think that insisting on narrow views on how to bring this issue forward will simply perpetuate the stalemates that we have been seeing for the past 40, 45 years. I think that Oyu Wang and his proposal for a focus on interpretation of existing international law is an example of the fresh thinking that we need. I think that we can and should examine this and how we are going to frame our continuation of our debates. And also, I think that Alexandra made a very interesting point, building on how Dr. Wang's comments, which is the need to integrate other areas beyond the specific remit of space security and safety. One issue that comes to my mind is the issue of ICT security. I think that cyber attacks against space systems have become an increasing threat, and I think that we need to promote convergence between our debates on PAROS and ongoing debates on ICT security. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have the last word now to you, Aya.
I think in the end, it all comes down to the question of how we, all actors, make sure the maybe fairness in terms of access and use of orbit, no matter what we are discussing for current as well as the future generations. And when I think of that, each actors have a responsibility to do something to make sure that. And as Hannah said, I think bottom-up approach, whatever, I think it's important. I mean, I don't deny the importance of having international agreement or legally binding documents, but at the same time, there are certainly things that each actors can start right now. So I think if we say priorities, bottom up, and do whatever we have to do or we can do now, it needs to be taken as priority. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aya. I think with that sort of rich collection of projects and activities to keep all of us busy for some time, I think we can now close this panel. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the panelists for taking the time to join us, provide their constructive insights. This discussion is very much appreciated.